Well, thank you for coming. My name is Mark Raimondi. I'm Chief of Staff at the Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a bipartisan, nonprofit geopolitical think tank. Those are words you only hear in DC. So this is a ransomware panel. The two hottest things seem to be ransomware and AI these days. So we're going to start out with ransomware. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Ann Neuberger, who is National Security Advisor for Cyber, said last week in an interview at CFR with Dave Sanger that ransomware is estimated to have cost the global economy $8.7 trillion last year. And I've seen that figure used with cybercrime, not specifically ransomware, but regardless, that's a staggering amount. But what was even more staggering is in Singapore, Ms. Neuberger said that they're estimating that by 2027, the cost of cybercrime will rise to $23 trillion annually. I just don't, I tried to put that in context, and I couldn't find anything that costs that much. So, Brian, let's start off. This is a very international week. We have 50 entities, mostly countries, but also a couple organizations like the EU and Interpol, who are here for the administration's counter-ransom initiative. And it seems, so I'd like to, first question is based around international cooperation. It seems that there's a small number of irresponsible nations that harbor and protect the ecosystem that is used for ransomware. And so my question is, especially when we have so many cyber leaders this week, can you talk to us a little bit about the role or the need or the importance of international partnerships in this space?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Vorngen. As Mark said, I have responsibility for the FBI cyber program. And for a little humor, I get about 30 emails a week asking to sell me cybersecurity tools, and I have to tell them, talk to somebody else. We work with people like Sandra and Google and Mandiant to help prevent it and deal with the actors. So when you look back to as early as November 2021 with the Sodinokibi disruption, you get into calendar year 2023 with the disruptions of Hive, with Genesis Marketplace, Snake malware, and most recently the Quackbot disruption. I think one thing we are most proud of is that the growing line of agencies and private sector partners, both domestically in the US and globally, is expanding at the bottom of our press releases. So when you go back and you'll look at in 2021, you'll see references to companies like Bitdefender, who played a very significant role, and some of the others are obviously notable, Microsoft and some others. But we're very, very proud of the growth of those, what we say domestic, international, public-private partnerships. But on the international side, the bottom line is we are not going to be nearly as effective as we are without those partnerships. And we place a premium on those partnerships through the work we do with them, through how we share with them, and through how we're doing capacity growth. When you look at our capacity growth over the past 2 to 3 years, we've put 16 dedicated cyber legal attaches in 16 dedicated countries, and we're going to grow that by an additional 6 in calendar year 2024. So the point is, do capacity, do capability, build speed of trust relationships in critically important environments internationally so that we can use everyone's authorities and capabilities in concert so to pose maximum cost on our adversaries. So that's probably the best answer I can give you, Mark.
Thank you. Sandra, do you have anything on the international cooperation that you'd like to add? You don't have to. I can go to the next question.
Well, I would just say that from the point of view of responding to ransomware events, the only people that benefit from not saying anything and not cooperating are threat actors, because the more that we share about their tactics, the more that we talk about what's going on, the more that we're transparent about it, the less tools and opportunity we give to them. So I think, +1 to what Brian said.
Thank you. The same interview, Deputy National Security Advisor Neuberger, this is the interview with the Council of Foreign Relations with Dave Sanger about 4 or 5 days ago. She said one of the priorities for the CRI, that's the Counter Ransom Initiative, gathering this week is she's going to try to get an agreement or a communication that agrees that none of the 50 members will support the paying of ransom by governments. And that's certainly a laudable end state, but I want to see if that's something that is something that the FBI is looking for right now, or if that's something that the private sector responders think that would help or hurt. So you want to start off?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I actually applaud this from the perspective of we need to make bold initiatives in this space. And even if this might sound aspirational, it's a really great starting point to see if governments can sign on to this, because there really is something absurd about a government paying a ransom. That being said, I do think that we need to do this in a way where we're not leaving victims by themselves to deal with things that happen. So we need to provide some kind of collective defense on this. If we're going to say, don't pay a ransom, then we need to be there to help them with remediation. We need to be there to give them options, because this can get ugly very fast. Some of the things that we're responding to, especially some of the more aggressive groups, can make it so beyond anything that we've seen. The aggressive threats, the way that they are being abused by some of these ransomware actors. I can give you countless examples of the type of physical threats. We're going to send shooters to your house. We're going to threaten your family members. Even government officials will get threats. So if we're going to put that very bold and aspirational statement out there, I just think it needs to be coupled with what are we going to do to drop everything and support in the event that one of our partners gets into trouble.
So Sandra's obviously very, very bright in how she delivers her messages. I'll do my best to add a little bit more. There's never been a more important conversation to understand second, third, fourth order effects of a decision. And when you look at the proposition to ban ransom payments or to prohibit them, or whatever terminology we want to use, I think it's important that we look at this from the victim perspective. If you are a hospital and you're running a cardiology ward and you're banned from paying ransoms, then what? Right? To Sandra's point, what then is the U.S. government in a position to do? Because right now we're not in a position to really remediate systems. So that's a private sector industry business. And there's all of these other considerations that come into play. One for me is if I'm a victim and I have to pay to maintain my business, and now I'm going to be exposed to yet another arm of extortion. You have the encryption extortion, you have the data exfiltration extortion, now you have I've made an illegal payment, I can be extorted for that. So just really double down on what Sandra said about really looking at it from the victim perspective and understanding all of the derivative impacts from that potential decision. So I'll stop there. I think what Sandra said is excellent.
Thank you both. And also for the audience, we are going to go to audience questions after a few more questions, so please think of some. And, so just to establish a foundation or a baseline for ransomware, let's get back to basics. And can you walk us through what is the ecosystem of ransomware criminal gangs? Who's doing it, where do they do it from, where do they get the tools, how are they paid? How do they launder? All right, I'll start at a topical basic level, and then I'll turn it over to Sandra for some more details. So, it's termed ransomware as a service, and essentially what you have is you have core groups of people that essentially develop the malware, right? In the traditional ransomware as a service ecosystem, just say that's a small group of very, very highly experienced, skilled operators who code and develop very, very sophisticated malware. And then you have the affiliate model, which would be someone, not me personally, but somebody that's not tied to the malware developers, where I can essentially use that sophisticated malware. I can create access to a potential victim by buying initial access or by creating the initial access. I can create the event where there's an intrusion, and then there's multiple steps, right? There may be an encryption event, there may be a data exfiltration event, there may be
an extortion event against, or aggressive tactics taken against company executives or business executives. And so you have multiple different tactics, techniques, and procedures that the actors use. Recently, we're seeing dual encryption events or dual ransomwares, malware sets used against the same victim to make it more difficult for the victim to recover. I will say one more thing, and I'll turn over to Sandra because I think she has some fascinating detail on this. When you look at the data, the people that recover the best are those who have air-gapped encrypted backups, real-time backups. So if there's one focus point, it's that, real-time air-gapped encrypted backups are your most direct way to recover from an event.
So what I thought I would do is just tell a little bit about how we got ourselves recruited by a ransomware gang to see it from the inside. And this is we manage thousands of personas in the underground to monitor what threat actors are doing, what are they selling, what are they planning. That's one of the pillars of where we get some of our insights. And during, if you recall, the Colonial Pipeline incident, the people that were involved with that were the dark side ransomware gang. So what we did was we got ourselves recruited by dark side ransomware gang. And we did this by, you have to have somebody who's not coming from the US, somebody who speaks perfect Russian, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the few, the things that we learned from this are that it was run as a very professional, lucrative business. So the sliding pay scale, for example, the more that you request in ransom, the less your fee is. There was a nice interface, a beautiful sort of UX for the affiliates. And by the way, nobody knows each other. So if you're an affiliate or you're, leading this, all of the people that are involved in conducting the ransomware event or the extortion event have never met and never will. So you could have 20, 30 people involved that will never meet each other. Some of the other things that we saw was that they were willing to help if you ran into trouble. So if you're an affiliate and you are conducting this operation, there was a chat that would run on the side that would tell you, how to proceed or if you needed advice. And then what ended up happening, if you recall, there was this big sort of public appeal by DarkSide Ransomware Gang where they talked about that they were donating to charity, and then they sort of just decided, well, we're going to disappear. And what happened in the underground that we were watching was that groups started to see and feel the pressure of the Department of Justice on them, and they started to ban ransomware from their chat forums. And then they started DDoSing each other. It was wonderful. It was this amazing moment of implosion with bad guys that we had never seen. And so they supposedly disappeared, right? They just said, we're done. We're gonna stop doing this. Well, a few weeks later, they sort of come up under a different, what I'll call brand, right? Same group, different interface, but they're basically extremely resilient. So you have this very resilient, lucrative ecosystem, made up of people who have never met and never will, that are making millions and millions of dollars through these extortion ransomware events.
Thank you both. So, Brian, I'm going to combine a couple questions here. What percentage of the cyber cases that FBI are working are ransomware, number one? And then number two, we talked about the ecosystem, the different players, the developers, the intrusions. Where is the best interdiction point there from your point of view? Like what are the best ways to actually target the these ransomware gangs and have a real impact where it's not just whack-a-mole? Now and true and aspirational, like what you're doing now and then what you think we collectively ought to be doing.
Yeah, I probably missed this question in the prep notes, so I got to be careful on my answer on the first one. But we dedicate a huge amount of resources to ransomware. I'll just say that, right? We have obviously 56 field offices in the United States that are engaged with victims, certainly weekly, if not daily, throughout the country. In terms of straight percentages, it's a really hard question to answer, Mark. But we dedicate a significant amount of daily, weekly, monthly, annual resources to ransomware. When we look at the ransomware problem, we look at it in 4 distinct pillars, right? Actors, infrastructure, communication nodes, and the flow of money, right? And we believe that each one of those needs to be targeted as its own ecosystem and disrupted as its own ecosystem. because we have a tendency, I think, to look at the ransomware problem, not necessarily Sandra or myself, but, you know, we have a tendency to look at the ransomware problem and say, well, it's this group of people using this malware, using this infrastructure, attacking this victim. Well, it doesn't really work that way. There's tons of interdependencies. There's tons of overlap between infrastructure being used by actors. And so it's important that we target each one of those pillars in a dedicated way. The reality is, without the actors, none of this happens. So an enormous amount of our attention goes to the actors. But when we look at disruptions, and let's use the most recent one with QuackBot, it targets all four. You know, the actors, the infrastructure, the communication nodes, and the money. In terms of disruptive activity, you know, until the safe haven problem is dealt with in Russia, it's going to be a problem, right? I think that's a fair statement. That includes not just the safe haven status of the actors and what they can and can't do there, but you even take it into laundering crypto proceeds and the OTCs there that they use to essentially turn crypto into fiat currency. Very, very challenging for us to deal with. We have, and I say unfortunately, have seen a movement of ransomware actors outside of Russia to more favorable countries where we have more favorable relationships. And so as we see this more, I don't want to call them juveniles because they're not necessarily that, but as we see a younger crop of criminals starting to come into the ecosystem, some of them are not in Russia. And our traditional law enforcement tools, our traditional diplomacy can work and can be much more impactful there. And so we're super focused on that. But at its most basic level, you have to target the actors, the infrastructure, the money, and the comms channels.
Does that duplicate? Is that the answer that would be for network defenders as well? Is there another?
Yeah, I think that Brian really, you know, enumerated the entire, you know, ecosystem pretty well. I think that another way to say it is that when you think of the ransomware ecosystem, and the IST Ransomware Task Force did a lot of good work in enumerating what that ecosystem looks like. And you can see where there are legitimate services, or even, let's say, gray area services that make up part of that ecosystem. And that's a real opportunity, is where can you influence on these businesses that may or may not know, maybe they don't want to know, that they are a part of this ransomware ecosystem, and that engagement creates a huge opportunity for us as well. So even as network defenders, if we can look at that ecosystem and find the weak points in where sort of gray area or even, you know, legitimate businesses are operating, and we can say, you know, don't give this email address an API key, don't give this, you know, we can make an impact there as well.
Thank you. So ransomware is, everybody in this room knows a bit about ransomware, and every time I have a conversation with Brian or Sandra or other people like them, I learn something new. So my question is, what don't we know right now? Like, what do you think is on the scene now that has maybe modified from the way that it was done in the past? Like, what are folks missing right now, if anything? Maybe there aren't. But is there anything that you wish that that the victims that you deal with, Brian, or the clients that you deal with, hopefully before the victims know?
Well, I think an important piece is what I mentioned before, is that some of these ransomware operators and some of these they're getting so aggressive. And they're getting, you know, some of them really don't have a rules of engagement framework. And they're doing everything they can to embarrass and coerce, and doing this in such a personal way. You know, there was one incident where the people, and forgive me for the, you know, the shocking nature of this, though, that they were emailing this person's wife to tell her the ways that they were going to kill her, right? And it's just that the level of stress and the level of abuse taken by these victims, it is very hard to create policy and to say things like, we need to, you know, ban ransomware payments when you're dealing with somebody in an entity that has no rules, right? Where it's open season on good, innocent people. I think that's the piece that's missing. It's also, if you've ever been a part of this, to actually look in the eyes of the people who are suffering from this kind of embarrassment and coercion, it's a totally different ballgame. You know, and to layer on with what, you know, what Brian was talking about, these things can extend into hospitals and places where critical services are being provided. I don't think the average American knows this. I don't think the average American is tracking this, that this trend towards very aggressive, very personal pieces are happening. But I can tell you that a lot of the businesses where we do respond or where we're giving advice, they run tabletops at the executive level and at the mid-level. And one of the things they're exercising now, which I think is a great idea, and we do recommend they do that, is to run scenarios that bring in that personally aggressive piece to the story. So, you know, the scenarios maybe a couple years ago were, okay, you know, you have half of your computer shut down and they want this much money. Now they're practicing a scenario where the CEO's, you know, wives' pictures are being released, or, you know, they're getting into these scenarios where an employee's being abused. And I think it's an unfortunate thing that we have to deal with. But if I were to pick one thing I don't think the average person gets, it's that this is where we are with this, and it's very sad.
So Brian, the FBI has a fantastic capacity to make multimedia educational or awareness products. I've seen a bunch of them on terrorism. I've seen them on other things. Do you think that that's something that, given what Sandra was just talking about, that the FBI might consider doing for ransomwares to increase the knowledge of that this isn't just getting your computer bricked, it could be personal threats?
You know, when we look at the architecture, I'm going to be a little technical here, under Presidential Policy Directive 41, what you're describing is traditionally CISA's role. So we always message to industry, I'll just use that term broadly, whether that's academia, whether that's for-profit organizations, international organizations, all of the best practices, right? They're jointly published traditionally with CISA and with NSA. Sometimes we do our own on CVEs. But would we consider it? Certainly happy to consider it, not opposed to it. But when we look at how we communicate, we really do it through the cybersecurity advisory construct. And we have very, very robust documentation already put together in terms of best preventative steps in terms of resilience and net defense. I can't recall if we've done a video yet, but certainly happy to consider that. If I can make a note off of Sandra's last question, just for everybody here, I think Sandra hit on some really important points. One of them was tabletop exercises, right? And just to expand that a little bit, for all of the reasons that she mentioned, when we talk about tabletop exercises, essentially for ransomware, we say, listen, you really have to plan for 4 things, right? Number 1 is plan to use your primary band of communication. Just plan for it, right? So if your CEO or your director level individual, your principal, has a primary cell phone, assume it's gone, right? That it can't be used from robo-texting, robocalls, whatever else. Plan for out-of-band communications. The second decision is pay, no pay, right? Sandra has more experience with this than I do, but even from my experience, the best prepared organizations, this is a math problem, right? This basically says, if we expect to be down for this long, this is what our payment is in terms of revenue and profit, and it's a math problem to them. That drives their negotiation, how aggressive they're going to be, how much time they're willing to negotiate. The third is, will or won't you share with your government? And that's heavily debated. Certainly from where I sit, more information means more help, right? But we also understand that that's an internal organizational decision. I will note right now, I just had a conversation with somebody on the margins of this conversation, which is when we see major underreporting, it does prevent our ability to move more quickly against disruptions, because we need to see the infrastructure that was used to catalyze those attacks, because that becomes really, really important from an evidentiary perspective. And then the fourth is, what and when will you share with your board of directors, if you have a board of directors, and what will you actually ask of your board in terms of engagement? Those are the 4 things we coach people through on TTXs that we think are important.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to go to audience questions. I don't know if we have a microphone in the audience, but I can, we do. So Pierre can you bring it up to the front, please? Your front, right? And when you ask a question, please say your name and your organization and a question, not statement.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here. My name is Dorian. I'm the co-chair of the so-called DC Cybersecurity Task Force within the Romanian American Chamber of Commerce here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also affiliated with George Mason University. My question is, actually, if I can, 2 questions, is that possible? You mentioned those great numbers in terms of the cybercrime. I'm curious to what extent, and this is probably for all the 3 of you, to what extent there is a causation, a correlation between the economic inequality and increase of cybercrime. And second would be, Sandra alluded to this, related to the aggressiveness of the aggressors. Is the aggressiveness determined by geopolitical events? What do you see? Thank you so much.
I'll take a stab. So growing inequality, I would say that there are a lot of things driven by growing inequality, but when you look at the threat actors who are conducting ransomware attacks, we don't have evidence connecting them with an unequal distribution of wealth in the country. So what we're seeing is individuals who have technical ability. We're seeing that they are generally in a very lucrative business and have typically, I would say in the vast majority of them are in nations where there's safe harbor for those types of activities. So I think it's mostly geopolitics that's driving some of this, and the tacit consent of the host nation that I would say is the main driver. And then the second question, what was
Well, we only have a couple minutes, so I'm sorry. We can get to your second question one-on-one, but I want to, can we ask both questions? Can you ask your question, and then you, sir, ask your question, and then we'll wrap that answer up in one.
My name is Rastianuta from Slovakia. I have a question. You are talking mostly about what happened when ransomware attack occurs. Why we are not talking more or mostly about how to minimize possibility of ransomware attack in general? We are not talking here about preparation. We are not talking about training. We are not talking about how to ensure that possible targets will be better prepared. No one is talking about this, so that's my question.
Thank you for that question, sir.
I'm Bob West with Palo Alto Networks. I'm on the Prisma Cloud leadership team, the cloud security division. I'm curious if you're seeing what's consistent with what I see. You know, we publish statistics in security about the cost of a breach, and the last one I saw was somewhere in the order of $5 million. But I would say those statistics are off, certainly in the Global 2000. I worked with a client before I joined Palo Alto Networks, and we estimated the total cost for the breach was about $500 million in year one, with lost business, litigation, and regulatory fines. Is that consistent with what you're seeing?
So just to answer the first question, I totally agree. We could have had a session just on that. And I hope that there will be other discussions today that do address resilience and other methods of how not to become a victim. Regarding the second question, do either of you want to take a shot at that? We have about a minute.
I don't have an answer to the second question. Real quickly on the first question, I have an itemized list for you if you want it. You know, but in short, it comes down to, can an organization implement and execute repeatable security controls throughout the entirety of an organization, right? MFA, phishing, prevention, air-gapped encrypted backups. So there's a list of them, right? But the problem, use my organization for example. We're 38,000 people. We have I don't know how many offices we have, but hundreds, right? Can you get people's behavior to be identical based on those systemic policies? That is a real challenge, right? And so that's my short answer to that question. I don't have an answer to the second question.
Well, I would say that 5 million seems very low to me when I think about lost productivity, ransom payment, mitigation costs, incident response work, the SLAs that you pay for in advance. When I think all of those things, when you have a business outage, depending on the size of your organization, every minute counts. So I would say 5 million sounds like a bargain, unfortunately.
Well, again, I want to thank the Paris Summit, Washington edition for this opportunity. I want to thank my panelists here, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Thank you.